Hey guys, tonight we begin something a little grim. Not dragons, not knights, not even medieval romance. No. This is about survival. Raw, relentless, unglamorous survival in the Middle Ages. A time when your biggest morning victory was not stepping in human waste. A time when the word comfort hadn't been invented, and where every new sunrise was less of a gift and more of a dare. So, before we get too cozy in our well-heated homes and soft cotton beds, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments, where are you watching from? What time is it for you right now? It always amazes me to see this little community from every corner of the world, sharing peace, one weird historical bedtime story at a time. Now, dim the lights, turn on a soft fan if you like that distant hum, fluff your pillow, and let's begin tonight's strange journey together. Because you just woke up in the year 1312. Congratulations, you're not dead. Yet. But don't celebrate. Because life, it's not going to get easier from here. You're in a one-room wooden hut that smells like mouldy goat and smoked onions. The walls creak, the roof leaks. And your bed? A pile of straw that's been slept in by so many generations, it probably qualifies as a medieval family heirloom. You turn your head and immediately regret it. There's a chicken on your chest. Not a metaphor. An actual chicken, staring at you like you stole its bed. Your back is sore, your knees are loud, and your blanket smells like wet hay and old soup, because it is wet hay and old soup. Wool blankets back then weren't washed. They were aired out, which is medieval for shake it near the fire and pretend it's fine. And now the church bell rings. No snooze button. No gentle wake-up alarm with bird chirps, just the iron clang of guilt and divine obligation. Time to rise and shine, if you can. You sit up and immediately feel the ache. You're 25, basically elderly in medieval terms. Your spine sounds like dry twigs snapping in a fire. And your feet? They're already cold, damp, and stuck to the floor in ways that shouldn't happen. You walk to the door, but there isn't one. Just a hole covered with a fur that used to be a wolf, but now smells like despair and cheese. Outside, the sky is grey, the mud is eternal, and your neighbour's sheep is already peeing where your boots are supposed to go. Ah, the joys of rural medieval life. Your house, if you can call it that, is home to you, your siblings, your parents, your great-uncle with the mysterious cough, 2 goats, and a rotating cast of rodents. There are no walls inside. No curtains, no rooms, just one big shared airspace for dreams, drool, and dysentery. But wait, nature calls. Unfortunately, medieval nature does not have indoor plumbing. Your toilet? A bucket, if you're lucky. If not, you head out to the communal trench behind the goat pens, which is already steaming with everyone else's early morning regrets. There's no toilet paper, no wipes, no soft quilted 3-ply, just straw, or moss, or your left hand. You hope it's straw. Now comes the fun part. You toss your, business into the street. Yes, the same street where children play and where people walk barefoot. You're supposed to yell something, maybe garde a lou, to warn people. But let's be honest, you didn't yell. Nobody does. And someone's going to step in it. Now back inside. Time for breakfast. If you're hoping for eggs, toast, or anything Instagram-worthy, you're going to be disappointed. Your meal is pottage. Pottage is a medieval dish that looks like oatmeal had a mental breakdown. It's made of boiled grains, leftover roots, maybe a bean or two if you're lucky. It's been bubbling in the same pot for a week. New ingredients are added, old ones are forgotten, and the smell. A sour mix of cabbage, dirt, and vague suffering. On the side, a rock-hard lump of bread that could double as a home defense weapon. It's made of barley, acorn flour, and whatever else was lying around. It doesn't bend. It breaks things, including your teeth. What do you drink with this? Beer. Yes, beer. At 6 in the morning. Because water? Water is not your friend. It's filled with bacteria, parasites, and sometimes chunks. So instead, you drink a weak ale. Low alcohol, high survival rate. Even the kids drink it. Yes, your toddler starts their day with ale. Weak ale, but still, medieval baby's first pint. Now that your stomach is full of swamp stew and medieval beer, it's time to get dressed. This takes exactly 3 seconds, because you have one outfit. 1. A wool tunic that's scratchy, sweaty, and smells like regret. It hasn't been washed in months. It stands up on its own. And the only way to tell front from back is which side has fewer fleas. Underwear? Optional. Most peasants go commando. It's not freedom, it's just threadbare priorities. Shoes? Maybe. If you're lucky, you have worn leather flaps tied with string. If not, it's barefoot life for you. In winter, in dung, in gravel, with open sores and zero sympathy. Your skin itches constantly, because everyone, and I mean everyone, has lice and fleas and weird rashes that have rashes of their own. You scratch yourself with whatever's nearby, a spoon, a stick, your neighbour's hoe, and nobody judges you, because they're doing it too. Now it's time for hygiene, a little morning freshening up, except no soap, no sink, no toothbrush, no anything. You might chew on a stick to clean your teeth, or swish your mouth with vinegar, but mostly your mouth is a war zone, your teeth are brown, your gums are bleeding, your breath could take down a cow, and no one cares, because dental pain is just a fact of life. If a tooth goes bad, you go to the village barber, who also happens to be your surgeon, and he'll pull it out with pliers that haven't been cleaned since the last crusade. No anesthesia, just a prayer and a rag to scream into. Now that you've eaten your flavourless porridge, fought with your shirt, and debated flossing with a chicken feather, it's time for work. Except, you don't have a job, you have a lord. He owns the land, you work it, and you give him a portion of everything. Food, labour, chickens, you name it. You labour from sunup to sundown. You plough, you plant, you pray the crop survives. There are no weekends, there are no breaks, just pain and more pain, in slightly different weather. And the saddest part, if your crop fails, if your back gives out, if your child gets sick from bad stew, nobody helps. You're just replaced, quietly, efficiently, and life goes on. Let's say you've made it to midday, your body's aching, your face is covered in sweat, dirt, and maybe yesterday's porridge, and you've already dodged the morning chamber pot explosion from a second-story window. You're alive, and that counts for something, because in the Middle Ages that's not guaranteed past breakfast. Let's start with something essential. Water. Seems harmless, right? Looks clear. Sounds calming. Maybe there's a sparkling brook just outside the village, gliding over smooth stones. But here's the truth. That stream you're eyeing so romantically, someone just dumped a dead pig in it, someone else emptied a latrine, and the tanner up the road has been soaking hides in it for weeks. It's not water, it's a medieval cocktail. 1 part disease, 2 parts death, with a hint of tragedy. That's why you don't drink it. You drink beer, warm, flat, slightly sour beer, not because you're a party animal, but because it's boiled, and boiling kills things. You brew it at home in big wooden vats, adding grain, herbs, and the tears of anyone who hoped for a coffee instead. Even children drink it. Yes, your toddler starts their day with ale. Weak ale, but still. Medieval baby's first pint. Wine? That's for the wealthy. And even then, it's not stored in bottles. It's in wooden casks next to the salted fish. So if it tastes like pickled regret, that's just part of the charm. Bathing? Ah yes. The sweet fantasy of being clean. People do bathe. Sometimes. But not regularly. Because in the 14th century, many believe bathing is dangerous. That opening your pores is like leaving the gate open for disease to walk right in. Doctors, such as they are, encourage not washing. Dirt is considered protective, a natural barrier against bad air. And in case you're wondering, yes, germ theory does not exist yet. People don't know about bacteria. They think disease comes from bad smells or punishment from God. So, if you do wash, it's rare. A wooden tub, a fire, hours of effort. And afterward, everyone in your house shares the same bath water. That's right. First your father, then your mother, then you, then your 3 siblings, then the dog. By the time it's your turn, the water looks like stew and smells worse. Now let's talk about clothes. You own 1 outfit, maybe 2 if you're lucky or recently raided someone's clothes line. It's rough wool or scratchy linen. It's never been fully cleaned, and the seams are held together with hope. If it rains, you're wet. If it's hot, you sweat. If it's cold, you shiver. No zippers, no elastic, just rope ties and buttons that somehow multiply or vanish overnight. Your shoes, if you have them, are thin leather flaps with holes. Walking in them feels like apologizing to your own feet every step. Most of the time it's just easier to go barefoot, through mud, through dung, through disease puddles no one talks about. And the result? Fungal infections, blisters, splinters that become infected and lead to, well, death. Let's say you're lucky enough to have stayed upright this far. Your stomach grumbles. You think, maybe it's time for lunch. You sit down, grab your wooden bowl, and it's the same meal again. Pottage, still bubbling on the hearth since Monday. Except now it's Thursday. What's in it today? A turnip, half a leek, some herbs that may or may not be weeds, and the same ladle of grey broth you've had all week. You gulp it down, chewing slowly and trying to ignore the strange, chewy texture that might be rat tail. On special days, there's bread, but don't picture fluffy loaves. No, no. This bread is harder than your landlord's heart, and it might have bark in it, or sawdust, or powdered bones. Because in bad harvest years, you stretch flour with whatever's lying around, even clay. And yes, sometimes that bread makes you hallucinate, because of ergot, a fungus that grows on rye. So now you're dizzy, seeing ghosts and still hungry. Congratulations, you've just been medieval, poisoned by bread. What about meat? Only if you're a hunter. And hunting? That's illegal unless you're nobility. Poach a deer? You could be executed. Yes, they'll kill you for killing a rabbit. So most people don't eat meat, maybe on a feast day, maybe when the Lord feels generous. Even then it's dried, salted, or so old it argues back. Vegetables? Only what's in season. And it's always turnips. Turnips in soup. Turnips in porridge. Turnips in your dreams. Fruit? If you get it, eat it fast. No fridge. No storage. By morning, it's mush with bugs. Cheese and butter are common. But risky. Made from milk that sat out too long, handled by people who never washed their hands, and stored in a room with questionable ventilation. So every bite you take is a gamble. Will it nourish you, or send you straight to the priest? But let's say the food doesn't get you. Let's say you avoid infection. Let's say you don't drink the stream. There's still the weather. In winter, your home becomes an icebox. Your roof leaks. The walls let in every breeze. Your firewood is wet, scarce, or illegal to gather. And yes, people are executed for stealing firewood from noble forests. You huddle under a single blanket with your family, shivering and whispering prayers. Your fingers go numb. Frostbite is called bad luck, and no one has enough socks. In summer, your house turns into an oven. No ventilation, no fans, no deodorant. Your wool tunic soaks through. You smell like boiled sweat. You can't take layers off, because that's scandalous. And you still have to work all day in the sun. Mosquitoes swarm. Flies land on everything. Your thighs chafe like they're trying to start a fire. And through it all, through every unbearable moment, your work doesn't stop. Sun up, sun down, rain, sleet, blistering heat. You keep digging, planting, lifting, hauling, because if you stop, you starve. There's no social safety net, no pensions, no sick leave. If you get sick, well, that's our next problem. Because the Middle Ages have medicine, just not the kind you want. So, you've endured the lice, the filth, the fever. You've survived the bread hallucinations, the leeches, and the screams from next door when someone's tooth got yanked out with pliers. You've made it this far, and that's impressive. But let's be honest, there's no retirement party waiting for you in the Middle Ages. No golden watch, no hammock, no pension. The only rest you're getting is death. Because in this world, death isn't an occasional visitor. It's a roommate, a shadow in the corner, a constant hum in the background. Let's start with the numbers. Life expectancy? Around 30 to 40 years. But that's not because everyone just drops dead at 35. That number is skewed because half of all children don't survive childhood. Infant mortality is sky high. Babies die from fevers, infections, accidents, and bad air. If you made it to age 5, you were considered a statistical miracle. If you made it to 10, you were already working full days. No toys, no school, just chores and the looming fear of winter. Now let's say you survive childhood. You get to be 30, maybe even 40. Congratulations, you're officially an elder. You're respected. You're also missing half your teeth, you smell like sour onions, and your back sounds like dry firewood snapping. So what kills you in the end? It could be anything. A cut that gets infected, a fever that burns too long, a cold winter with no firewood, a bad mushroom, or your neighbour's cow stepping on your foot and it never healing right, or childbirth if you're a woman, or war if you're a man, or the plague, or a famine, or just bad luck. There are no hospitals, no emergency rooms, no medicine beyond prayers and poultices, no rest days, no checkups. If you fall and you don't get up, you just don't. And when you die, it's usually fast, quiet, unmarked. Your family might wrap you in a linen shroud, if they can afford one. A priest might say a few words, or not. You're buried in a shallow grave behind the church or in a mass pit if there's a plague going on. No tombstone, no flowers, just dirt and silence. But before you get there, you might run into violence, because disease isn't the only thing out for blood. The Middle Ages are not peaceful. They are loud, angry, and often brutal. Laws exist, yes, but justice? Not really. Steal a loaf of bread? You could lose a hand. Gossip too much? You wear the scold's bridle, a metal cage with a tongue spike. Accused of lying in court, they pierce your tongue. Trial by jury, try trial by ordeal. Put your hand in boiling water and pull out a stone. If it heals in 3 days, you're innocent. If it doesn't, you're guilty. Or maybe they tie your hands and throw you into a river. If you float, you're a witch. If you sink, congratulations, you were innocent and drowned. Executions are public events. Beheadings, hangings, burnings. Townspeople gather with snacks. Children are brought along. It's entertainment. It's community bonding and trauma. Domestic violence, accepted. Street fights, common. You could get your face bashed in for looking at someone the wrong way, or for wearing shoes a little too nice for your social rank. And if that's not enough, there's war. Endless, pointless war. Nobles fighting over borders. Kings trying to impress the Pope. Lords arguing about land. You get called up to fight. No training. No armor. Just a dull blade, maybe a stick, and a vague hope that you survive. If you're noble, sure, you get a horse. But it's still a gamble. Arrows don't care how rich you are. And if you come back home, you're probably wounded. You're likely broke. You might even be missing an eye, a hand, or your will to keep going. And if you're a woman, then everything so far still applies. Plus childbirth, misogyny, and suspicion. From the moment you're born, your role is defined. Marry young, bear children, obey your husband, and die quietly. You might be married off at 13, pregnant by 14, not because of love, but because of property, land, livestock, dowries, and alliances. Childbirth is terrifying. No prenatal care, no trained doctors, no sanitation. Midwives try their best, but complications mean death for the baby, the mother, or both. Women die giving life every day. And those who survive, they return to work, immediately. Cook, clean, nurse, haul, mend, feed, serve, repeat. And heaven forbid you're single, or outspoken, or too educated. You'll be accused of witchcraft faster than you can say, I read a book. Having knowledge of herbs. Witch. Being unmarried at 40. Witch. Talking back to a man. Definitely witch. And yet, somehow, people still found joy. They laughed. They danced. They carved wood. They sang songs. They told stories. They loved each other. Fiercely. Quietly. In the dark. Because even in a world built on filth and fire, humans make room for light. That's the real miracle. Not survival. Not success. Not saints or swords or royal courts. The miracle is that people made music, even with missing teeth. That they told bedtime stories beside smoky fires. That they carved little animals from bone and made necklaces from shells. That they kissed their children, even when they knew some wouldn't live past the year. So tonight, when you lie in your clean bed, with running water, a ceiling that doesn't leak, and a door that locks, with aspirin in the cabinet, and food in your fridge, and central heating in your walls, maybe whisper a thank you to your toothbrush, to your shoes, to your mattress, to the people who lived and suffered and fought and died, so you wouldn't have to, because life in the Middle Ages wasn't noble, or magical, or even romantic. It was survival. Now let's talk about living conditions and survival strategies. When you picture life in the Middle Ages, you might think of knights on horseback, roaring feasts, or cheerful village fairs. But for the average peasant, winter wasn't festive. It was survival. It wasn't a season. It was a yearly showdown with nature, like being tested by a cruel, cold teacher who didn't believe in mercy or blankets. Imagine this. You live in a tiny hut made of mud and sticks, the kind where the walls are so thin you could probably hear a fox sneeze in the forest. No insulation, no real windows, just a tiny opening stuffed with old cloth or maybe an animal pelt. No fireplace thermostat, no fancy knobs, just arguments with your siblings over who gets to sit closest to the fire. And let's be honest, the inside of your house was usually just a slightly more polite version of whatever the sky was doing outside. If it's snowing out there, it's nearly snowing in here. And when the sun goes down, the real chill begins. Nights were the worst. Pitch black, wind snarling like a wild beast outside, the fire flickering weakly in the hearth, barely enough to toast the toes of whoever was sitting closest. If you were on the far end of the room, you might as well have been camping, in the woods, with wet socks and clothing. That didn't help much either. Peasants didn't own fancy cloaks lined with fur or plush feather beds. You had maybe 2 wool tunics, scratchy as hay bales, and a cloak that smelled like it had lost a bet with a goat. Layering them felt less like staying warm and more like building a sad wool sculpture of yourself. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. And as for bedding, forget it. Your bed was likely a wooden frame stuffed with straw or dried rushes, maybe an old sack. And as a bonus, fleas. Congratulations, you're never alone. The cold wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. Frostbite, hypothermia, and just quietly freezing in your sleep. It happened, a lot, especially to the very young and very old. So if you opened your eyes in the morning and could still feel your nose, that was a small miracle. Worth celebrating, maybe with a slightly thawed turnip, because surviving winter wasn't about being cozy. It was about piling on every scrap of fabric you owned, curling up beside the animals, and hoping you didn't wake up frozen to the floorboards. And honestly, that was just the beginning. Think your modern apartment has a draft, got a leaky window that whistles at night. Medieval peasants would laugh. Their homes weren't drafty. They were enthusiastic wind tunnels with a roof attached. Most houses were made using what historians gently call wattle and daub, which basically means weaving sticks together like a giant basket, then slathering the whole thing with a charming blend of mud, straw, and, well, manure. Yes, animal dung. Not for fun, but because it was cheap, sticky, and always in supply. But no matter how carefully applied, those walls didn't stand a chance against winter. The wind found every hole, every split, and turned your living room into a swirling icebox. No insulation, no barriers, just you, shivering in a room that never really invited you to be comfortable. Warmth, rare. Privacy, non-existent. Character development, off the charts. And the roofs? They looked nice, all golden and cozy in paintings. But in reality, thatched roofs sagged under snow, leaked in the rain, and sometimes hosted local wildlife. Because nothing says peaceful evening like a squirrel falling into your soup. Windows. If you had one, it was a tiny slit covered in a stretched animal hide or a warped piece of wood. And no, it didn't open or close neatly. It just kind of existed, like a sad eye watching the storm. So in the world of medieval peasants, home sweet home wasn't so sweet, but it was all they had. And somehow, they made it through. Glass was so expensive during the Middle Ages that even the local lord might only afford a single tiny pane in his manor house. As for peasants, they were just grateful if the wind didn't tear the cowhide off their wall in the middle of a blizzard, and it got worse. Floors weren't really floors, just compacted dirt. When it rained or snowed heavily, moisture would seep up from the ground, turning the inside of your home into a soggy, freezing marsh. Technically, you could say they had indoor water features, but no one was bragging about it. In the winter, every step inside your own home felt like trudging through a frozen swamp. Cold from above, cold from below, cold from within. It was a full-body attack from every direction. But medieval peasants didn't whine about it. They fought back with stubbornness and creativity. They packed moss into the cracks in the walls. They stuffed rags into drafty gaps. They huddled together for warmth, human insulation at its finest. Sometimes they rubbed sheep grease into the walls, hoping it would help keep the cold out. And if your house was falling apart and your best defense against winter involved mud, old cloth, and goat hair, well, you laughed about it, or tried to, assuming your teeth weren't chattering too hard. As if icy winds weren't bad enough, peasants also had to battle the cold rising silently from below. The ground beneath them, their floor, was the same frozen earth that carried winter in its bones. Floors were just slightly flattened dirt. Maybe, if you were lucky, someone had thrown down some straw or dried rushes to trick your feet into thinking it was a little more comfortable. But in truth, you were sleeping just one itchy layer away from the frozen ground. And that cold wasn't passive. It crept up like a ghost, curling through the straw, into your bones, and right into your soul. If you dropped anything onto the floor during a winter night, it was gone. Not lost, just frozen. Congratulations, it was now part of the permafrost. To battle the bitter cold, peasants did what they could. One method was layering the floor with thick mats of straw, if you had enough of it. More realistically, if you could sneak it from your neighbour's field without being noticed, you might create a halfway decent insulating barrier. But straw flattened fast, got mouldy even faster, and added a loud, crunchy soundtrack to every step, and every night spent tossing and turning. Some homes used dried rushes instead. They'd throw fresh ones on top every so often, but rarely cleaned out the old, rotting layers underneath. Over time, this formed a damp, decaying sandwich of decomposing plant matter, bugs, and mystery creatures no one dared name. It was medieval carpet padding. If your carpet was alive, slightly soggy, and smelled like something that had spent a week in a swamp. Beds, for those lucky enough to own one, didn't offer much relief. They were little more than wooden frames packed with, you guessed it, more straw. No mattress. No fluff. Just prickly, shifting bundles that rustled with every move. Tossing and turning wasn't about comfort. It was about staying alive. You'd move just enough to avoid freezing one side of your body before flipping over to save the other. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't conquer the cold ground. They simply endured it. They lived awkwardly, uncomfortably, just above it. A good night's sleep wasn't about softness or dreams. It was about waking up with all your fingers and toes still attached. And if you managed that, you were doing better than most. If there was one unsung hero in a medieval peasant's home during winter, it wasn't the walls, it wasn't the sagging roof, and it definitely wasn't the layer of frozen mud pretending to be a floor. No, the real champion was the hearth. A stubborn, flickering fire pit, often smoky and temperamental, but absolutely essential. In a world without heating, light bulbs, or anything even remotely resembling comfort, the hearth was the center of everything. Warmth, food, light, and a fragile sense of survival. At the heart of nearly every peasant dwelling sat a simple fire. No grand stone fireplace, no elegant chimney channeling smoke into the sky. Just a pit dug into the floor, or a few blackened stones with some partially burned logs doing their best to keep the dark at bay. And the smoke? It didn't go anywhere special. It hovered. It drifted lazily through cracks in the roof, through holes in the wall, or straight into your lungs. Breathing wasn't ideal. Your eyes stung constantly. But on the plus side, it did a wonderful job of fumigating fleas. Who needs pest control when you're living in a permanent cloud of smoke? But the fire wasn't just a heat source. It was the kitchen, the lantern, the evening entertainment. People sat around it after dark, telling stories, sharing village gossip, or simply staring into the flames, because frankly, there wasn't much else to do once the sun went down. Keeping the fire alive wasn't optional. Letting it go out overnight wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous. In the biting cold of a medieval winter, losing your fire was an open invitation for frostbite to move in and finish the job. And relighting it, no matchsticks, no lighters, no click-click whoosh. You had flint, steel, dry kindling if you were lucky, and frozen fingers that barely worked. Getting a fire started from scratch in the dead of night could take half an hour, 2 blisters, and more whispered prayers than an entire Sunday sermon. So peasants got clever. They learned how to bank the fire. Banking didn't mean saving it for retirement. It meant gently burying the glowing embers under a thick blanket of ash before going to bed. The ash insulated the heat, allowing the coals to smoulder, just barely, until morning. If you did it right, you could walk over at dawn, poke around, add some fresh wood, and the fire would come back to life without the drama. If you did it wrong, you'd be starting from zero, again, in the dark, in the cold. Fire banking was a tradition, an art passed down from parent to child. Everyone had their own technique. Some swore by dry ash. Others insisted a bit of dampness helped. Some packed the coals tightly. Others let them breathe. Suggesting a better way to do it was like starting a medieval family feud. It was the ancient version of arguing over how to start a barbecue, except instead of undercooked ribs, the stakes were your toes. Of course, things still went wrong. Sometimes a gust of wind would snake its way through a wall crack and snuff the fire out. Sometimes a clumsy goat would knock over the fire pit. Yes, that happened. That's why, in some homes, family members took turns getting up in the night to check the embers. It was the medieval equivalent of sleepwalking to adjust the thermostat. In the end, fire banking wasn't about conquering the cold. It was about buying yourself a few extra hours of warmth, just enough heat to make it through the night without becoming a human ice sculpture. And if you woke up and saw even a faint red glow beneath the ashes, that was your tiny victory, a spark of hope, a reason to face one more day of battling winter in a world where fire, smoky, stubborn, imperfect fire, was often the only thing keeping you alive. The phrase, "the more the merrier," wasn't just about parties in medieval times. It was a full-blown winter survival strategy. When the hearth grew dim and the wind howled through every gap in the walls, there was one guaranteed source of warmth: each other. And if that meant sleeping shoulder to shoulder with your parents, siblings, livestock, and possibly a confused goose or two, so be it. Forget personal space. That wasn't even a concept. On the coldest nights, comfort wasn't the goal. Survival was. Families piled into the warmest corner of the house, wrapped in every scrap of fabric they could find, forming what could only be described as a very determined, snoring human lasagna. Children were wedged between parents. Grandparents took the outer edges, and if Cousin Elfrida dropped by unannounced, someone just scooted over. There was always room. Kind of. If you were lucky, you got to sleep in the middle, where body heat radiated from all sides. If you were on the edge, well, you were basically hugging the drafty wall and reenacting what it feels like to sleep next to the open door of a walk-in freezer. And heaven help the poor soul who shifted too much in the night. One wrong move and you'd send Uncle Harold rolling into the icy corner, earning yourself the title of family villain until spring. Even bedding was communal. A single, flattened straw mattress often served several generations. Cleanliness? Not a top priority. Let's just say the aroma was layered. But when frostbite's knocking, you stop being picky. Smells could be ignored. Cold couldn't. Body heat was everything. In fact, some medieval advice books even recommended arranging the warmest, sturdiest folks on the outside of the sleeping pile, like a wool-clad human shield. Babies, the elderly, and anyone too sick or frail to survive the chill. They were bundled in the center, protected like tiny, precious radiators. And over time, this strategy evolved beyond necessity. It became routine. Cold nights brought families together, literally. They told stories, sang quietly under itchy blankets, and probably shared some strange late-night confessions with their faces buried in someone else's armpit. So, next time your pet takes over your bed or your sibling steals the blanket, just remember, at least you're not fighting for elbow space between a snoring uncle and a goat with opinions. And speaking of goats, they weren't outside. They were inside. So were the pigs, chickens, and cows. If it had a pulse and gave off warmth, it got a spot in the house. This wasn't some quirky village superstition. It was a practical, heat-saving decision. Animals gave off warmth, and in homes where insulation was a joke, and the wind could whistle through your pillowcase, every warm body mattered. Plus, keeping livestock indoors had bonus benefits. If the goat was sleeping against your wall, it was a lot harder for someone to sneak off with it in the night. Warmth and theft protection in one smelly package. At night, the house transformed into a chaotic but toasty barn. Chickens roosted in corners, pigs snorted near the hearth, and cows, majestic and smug, stretched out near the walls like they paid rent. It wasn't glamorous, far from it. Imagine being trapped in a car for days with someone who skipped a few baths. Now imagine that someone is a cow, and it's winter, and there's no car, just 4 mud walls and no escape. By the time spring arrived, the smell of a shared winter couldn't be ignored. Lighting a candle didn't help. Your nostrils had already seen things, but medieval noses adapted. Complaining was useless. Everyone understood the trade-off. More animals inside meant fewer frozen toes outside. Certain animals even had assigned spots. Cows, being the biggest and warmest, got the prized positions near the people. Goats wormed their way inside too. Not that they needed an invitation. Chickens perched on beams or baskets. Pigs, they just plopped down wherever they felt like, usually right in the middle of the room like they owned the place. Sharing a living space with barn animals did come with its hazards. You might wake up to a chicken nesting in your hair. Or worse, step barefoot into something very unpleasant on your way to stoke the fire. Medieval mornings were full of surprises. Still, despite the noise, the smell, and the occasional hoof to the ribs, peasants knew the cold could kill, but a warm cow probably wouldn't. In the battle against winter's icy fingers, a breath of hot, slightly slobbery cow air could mean the difference between life and death. And when it came to winter fashion, it wasn't about looking good, it was about staying alive. No one cared about style. Peasants weren't flipping through the latest trends or debating colours. They were layering like their lives depended on it, because they did. The rule was simple. If you owned it, you wore it. Sometimes all at once. Start with a scratchy linen shirt. Itchier than it is warm, but it's a start. Then a thicker wool tunic on top. If you had a second one, layer it. Add saggy woolen leggings, a cloak that smelled like wet livestock, and, if you were truly blessed, a sheepskin so old it had seen 5 winters and lost most of its fluff. Now you were officially 10% warmer, and 90% itchier. But in the Middle Ages, that was the cost of survival. Fashion was measured in degrees, not compliments. Boots were a luxury few peasants could afford. Most made do by wrapping their feet in layers of cloth, worn-out rags, or whatever they could find, and then shoving the whole bundle into wooden clogs. If the cold still managed to creep in, and it usually did, you just added another rag and hoped it wasn't the toes last night on duty. And as for washing all those layers, forget it. Doing laundry in the middle of winter meant hauling your clothes to a frozen stream, smashing through solid ice, and risking pneumonia while waiting 2 full days for your only shirt to dry. That's if it didn't freeze into a sad, frosty banner halfway through. So, peasants took the practical path. They embraced the stink. Smelling like a mix of smoke, sweat, and livestock wasn't considered unpleasant. It was the cost of survival. In fact, the dirt and grease had an unexpected benefit. Over time, this layer of filth acted as insulation. It sealed in heat, clogged the gaps in fabric, and turned your clothes into a crude, if fragrant, medieval version of a thermal jacket. Not breathable, not clean, but weirdly effective. Accessories like hats, scarves, and gloves were highly prized. A simple woolen cap could be the difference between a safe night's sleep and waking up with your hair frozen to the wall. Gloves, if you had any, were often stitched together from scraps of leather or old fabric, looking more like sad puppets than anything fashionable. Children were wrapped until they waddled like overstuffed root vegetables, so bundled in wool and rags they could barely move. But style wasn't the point. Warmth was, and in medieval terms, being covered in grease, goat hair, and questionable fabric was the peak of winter fashion. So next time you complain about wearing 3 layers on a chilly morning, remember this. Medieval peasants walked around wearing half their wardrobe at once, looking like lumpy laundry bags with legs, and feeling grateful for it. In their world, dirt wasn't a sign of defeat. It was a tool, a strategy, a crusty badge of honor. See, winter brought a unique problem: heat loss. And while clean linen felt nice in theory, it was terrible for trapping warmth. Freshly washed clothes were light and breathable, which was great in summer, but during a medieval winter, breathable was just another word for freezing. That's where dirt stepped in. Over time, layers of sweat, grease, and good old mud built up on cloaks, leggings, and tunics, sealing the fabric against the wind. The grimmier your clothes, the less likely you were to lose precious body heat. Some even believed too much bathing in winter could make you ill. Better to keep the holy grime barrier intact. Bathing was a rare event. Laundry was even rarer. Soap, reserved for sacred occasions, like when a bishop visited, or just before you met your maker. So instead of stripping down and washing up, peasants simply added layers on top of the old ones. You didn't remove your undertunic, you just wore another one over it. Eventually, you became a walking timeline of the past 6 weeks. Each crusty patch told a story of work, weather, and maybe that one time you slipped in a pigsty and didn't quite recover. To outsiders, peasants might have looked like they'd given up on hygiene altogether, but they hadn't. They were just prioritizing survival. That itchy, greasy tunic, it was armor, a defense against frostbite, against waking up blue-lipped and frozen. It wasn't glamorous, but neither was freezing for the sake of smelling nice. And in a world where everyone stank equally, no one was offended. The human nose gave up. Scent blindness was a shared coping mechanism. So yes, filth in a medieval winter wasn't a failure. It was function. It was fashion. And if you had a thick, greasy outer layer by February, you were winning. Big time. And if you're still imagining medieval peasants curled up under embroidered quilts on plush feather beds, think again. The real picture was far more rustic. And by rustic, we mean, let's collapse onto a heap of old straw, try not to poke ourselves in the ribs, and hope we wake up tomorrow. Beds, in the medieval peasant world, were a luxury. And by luxury, we mean a rough wooden frame, if you could even afford one. Atop that, you'd likely find a large sack stuffed with straw, hay, or maybe some old rushes. That's it. No memory foam, no adjustable settings, no embroidered sheets, just a crunchy, lumpy, slightly pokey bundle that smelled faintly of livestock and poor life choices. Every shift in the night was accompanied by the charming soundtrack of rustling straw and the occasional sharp jab from a rogue stork, reminding you, comfort is a modern invention. Some peasants didn't even bother with the wooden frame. They simply spread the straw straight onto the dirt floor, a back-to-nature sleeping arrangement that today's influencers might romantically rebrand as earth-connected slumber. But back then, it was just called sleeping where the bugs lived. Straw mattresses, beyond being itchy and uneven, were temporary at best. Over time, the straw flattened, absorbed moisture, started to grow mold, and turned into a thriving ecosystem of unwanted guests. Changing the straw was a big event, something you might do a few times a year, or, realistically, only when the bedding started squirming on its own. Rushes were another popular choice. These long grasses were scattered thick across the floor, sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or rosemary in a brave attempt to mask the ever-present aroma of barnyard and sweat. For a day or two, the rushes did smell lovely. Then they became part of the general mess, trampled into the floor alongside mud, dropped food, and whatever else made its way in. But that wasn't the worst part. Fleas, lice, and other delightful companions loved bedding as much as peasants did. If you woke up scratching more than you slept, congratulations. You had the full, authentic medieval experience. Still, despite the itch and the smell, these beds were lifesavers. Piles of straw, scratchy as they were, insulated against the freezing earth, and clumping together on top of them, sharing warmth like huddled, shivering spoons, created precious pockets of body heat. It was medieval central heating, minus the thermostat, and with bonus bugs. So next time you melt into your soft, pressure-relieving mattress, picture a medieval peasant looking on from the afterlife, toothless and wrapped in old wool, whispering, "Must be nice." When your home is made of sticks, mud, and sheer willpower, winter drafts aren't just uncomfortable, they feel personal. Peasants didn't only fight the cold outside, they waged war against it from inside their own homes. The cold found its way in with a kind of determination that bordered on mean-spirited. Walls warped, mud cracked, roofs sagged. Every night the wind seemed to find a new crack, like a mischievous spirit testing your patience. So sealing the house became a winter ritual, an art form really. Moss, straw, cloth scraps, tufts of dry grass, and even animal hair were crammed into gaps. If it was soft, insulating, or vaguely squishable, it went into a hole. Some especially determined souls even added extra layers of mud and dung over the walls as a seasonal defense. Imagine standing outside in the freezing wind, slapping frozen manure onto your own house while convincing yourself, this is peak comfort, this is fine. Roof leaks brought their own drama. Thatched roofs, though affordable, didn't exactly keep out the weather, especially after a few good snowstorms. Peasants patched holes with cloth, reeds, and, in moments of desperation, chunks of turf swiped from nearby fields. Over time, every home began to look like a sad, soggy patchwork quilt, stitched together with hope and desperation. Doors and windows, when they existed, were basic slabs of wood attached with nails and sheer stubbornness. Window openings were covered with thick cloth or animal hides, sometimes soaked in fat to block out drafts. This helped, and added a mysterious, meaty scent to the room. Every night was a battle between human determination and the sneaky, relentless cold. You could be warm one minute, and then a sudden gust would slip through the one crack you missed and slap you in the face like winter's cold, bony hand. But despite it all, despite the gaps, the smells, the straw mattresses that doubled as flea farms, medieval peasants endured. Through clever hacks, relentless patchwork, and the simple refusal to give in to the freeze, they muddled through the darkest winters nature could throw at them, one muddy, smoky, straw-stuffed day at a time. When the cold crept in so deep it kept you awake at night, medieval peasants had a plan. And no, it didn't involve hot chocolate or electric blankets. It was much simpler, much rougher. They took turns staying awake. Sleeping in shifts wasn't some coordinated military-style operation with bells and whistles. It was born of necessity, a practical, desperate rhythm that ensured at least someone was always up, keeping the fire alive and the cold at bay. The system was basic but effective. Half the family would try to sleep, curling up under scratchy blankets and hay, while the other half huddled near the hearth, feeding the fire and stuffing moss into the latest drafty hole in the wall. If left unattended, the flames would quickly dwindle, and relighting a fire from scratch in the freezing dark was a battle of flint, frozen fingers, and whispered curses. So everyone took turns. You'd catch a few hours of stiff, noisy sleep. Then someone would elbow you awake, and it was your turn to poke at glowing embers, mumble at the smoke, and do your best not to trip over a pig sleeping near the fire. There were no alarms, no snooze buttons, just heavy eyelids, creaky joints, and rising bitterness at whoever was snoring the loudest. Children were drafted in early. As soon as you were old enough to hold a stick and stay awake without toppling over, you were part of the schedule. Grandparents often stayed by the fire longer, not just for their wisdom, but because getting up and down from straw bedding with arthritis felt like a full-body wrestling match. And when it was finally your turn to sleep, good luck, people moving around, animals grunting, wind rattling the shutters, and a sibling flailing an elbow into your ribs made rest more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Still, the system worked. It meant someone was always tending the embers, and as long as the fire didn't die, neither did you. So the next time you groan about getting up to adjust the thermostat or letting your pet out at 2 a.m., remember the medieval peasant squinting at a pile of sputtering coals at 3 in the morning, asking the universe, are toes really that important? And then there was breathing. Yes, even that became a survival tactic. In winter, the very air could betray you. Deep breaths through the mouth pulled freezing air directly into your lungs, air so cold it could trigger a cough that never left. In a time when pneumonia was a death sentence and doctors were rare, breathing the wrong way could be fatal, so peasants learned to adapt. They breathed carefully, slowly, shallowly, and only through their noses. It was their version of survival breathing. The idea was to let the air warm a little before it reached your chest. Not perfect, but better than hacking yourself into an early grave. One accidental gasp of icy wind, and you were wheezing for a week while someone brewed hot onion tea and muttered prayers over your head. Some even tied bits of cloth or the corners of their cloaks over their mouths at night, creating makeshift face warmers. Of course, by morning, the fabric would be damp, frozen at the edges, and clinging to your face like a soggy sponge, but it beat freezing from the inside out. Children were taught this early. Breathe slow, parents would whisper, through your nose. Panting like a dog indoors earned a scolding, and honestly, between harsh breathing rules, scratchy wool, and the joy of sharing a straw bed with a goat who had no concept of personal space, medieval childhood winters were educational. At night, buried under layers of cloaks, straw, and the faint steam of a nearby cow. Breathing became a kind of discipline, a quiet art. Inhale gently, exhale slower. Minimal movement, like a very grim medieval version of yoga, only with more frostbite and fewer motivational quotes. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't get much attention in the grand stories of history. But it worked. Breath by breath, shallow and steady, peasants made it through another freezing night. And in the long war against winter, that was more than enough. In the never-ending war against medieval winter, peasants discovered an unexpected ally, a full stomach. As it turned out, layering on another scratchy wool cloak wasn't as effective as piling your belly high with something dense and hearty. The logic was simple but brilliant. Food equals energy, and digestion equals heat. So, the more your insides were working overtime, the more warmth your body produced. Call it medieval thermodynamics. Eat heavy, stay warm, and maybe, just maybe, make it to morning without turning into a human icicle. So what was on the menu for a peasant preparing to brave a freezing night? Think big, bubbling pots of stew filled with whatever root vegetables were on hand. Turnips, onions, parsnips, the kind of produce that came out of the ground looking like they'd already seen hard times. Grains were a staple too. Thick oat porridge, barley gruel, and chewy slabs of rye bread so dense they could double as shields. If it was a special occasion, say after a festival or a rare animal slaughter, you might even score a chunk of salted pork or a sliver of dried sausage tossed into the pot. This wasn't cuisine made for Instagram. There were no dainty portions or elegant plating. It was one big, vaguely brown lump of food designed to sit in your belly like a hot brick and burn slow through the night. But this wasn't just about eating as much as possible. It was about eating strategically. Foods that took longer to digest, especially those rich in fat, provided a steady, slow release of warmth. A belly full of stew, bread, and just a touch too much lard. Peak medieval bedtime luxury. Parents made sure even the pickiest kids filled up. Nobody cared if little Thomas didn't like turnips. You ate the turnips, or you spent the night dreaming about how much warmer your life would have been if you had. Parenting was simple, brutal, effective. Of course, packing in a peasant's worth of calories before bedtime came with its own hazards. You might be warmer, but you were also risking a night full of strange, vivid dreams. The kind where you find yourself fighting a talking cabbage or running from a pig in chainmail. But it was worth it. Because in the end, peasants weren't aiming for gourmet. They were aiming to survive. And if that meant going to bed bloated, snoring gently under a ragged cloak beside a steaming cow, then so be it. Now, long before electric blankets and fancy mattress warmers, medieval peasants had to rely on good old-fashioned creativity. And that's where the haybox and the heated stone came in, two unassuming tools that became heroes of winter nights. Let's start with the haybox. It sounds humble, and it was, but it was brilliant in its simplicity. Take a sturdy wooden box, line it with thick hay, and you've built yourself a medieval heat trap. Peasants would toss a hot pot of stew or porridge into the haybox after cooking, bury it deep in the insulation, and seal it up. Hours later, the food would still be warm enough to eat without needing to reignite the fire. It was like a slow cooker, but made of hay and hope. But food wasn't the only thing they used hay to keep warm. Someone in the household, usually whichever unlucky child had the slowest reflexes, would be sent to grab a flat stone and toss it into the heart of the hearth. After letting it roast until it was dangerously hot and just shy of setting the house ablaze, they'd fish it out using tongs, sticks, or whatever tools hadn't already burned to a crisp. That sizzling rock would then be wrapped in cloth, stuffed into a pot, or bundled in more hay and slipped into the bedding, usually near the feet. Voila. A DIY heating pad, medieval edition. Of course, this came with risks. Wrap the stone poorly, and congratulations. You've just started a tiny, very localized house fire. Drop it on your foot. And, well, now your winter injury story has nothing to do with ice. But when it worked, it was magical. That little stone radiated heat for hours, warming stiff legs and icy toes just enough to help someone sleep without chattering. It may not have looked like much, a scorched rock, some hay, a wooden box, but to a medieval peasant, it was nothing short of a miracle. When you live in a house where the wind whistles through the walls and the frost creeps in under your bed, a warm stone or a hot pot of barley porridge can feel like a gift from heaven. Because in the grand survival toolkit of the medieval world, these weren't just tools. They were hope, disguised as hay and stone. And in a freezing, half-lit hut filled with snoring family members, rustling livestock, and dreams of warmer days, that little bit of warmth might be the only thing standing between you and a very chilly end. The closer you were to the fire, the better your odds of waking up unfrozen. Sleeping spots weren't chosen based on comfort or personal preference. They were assigned like battle positions. Infants, elders, and anyone sick or frail got prime placement near the hearth. It wasn't just kindness, it was survival math. Babies were fragile but gave off a surprising amount of heat, and the elderly, full of wisdom and gossip, were too precious to risk turning into snowmen. But being close to the fire didn't mean you were perfectly warm and cozy. Too near, and you might wake up with singed eyebrows or a cloak that smelled suspiciously like toast. Too far, and you might as well be sleeping in an open field with the cows. The fire didn't heat the whole room, it roasted whatever bodies were planted right in front of it. Everyone else was left fighting for a spot in the narrow wedge of warmth like cold-blooded lizards scrambling for a sunbeam. If you were lucky enough to drift off facing the fire, one side of your body could enjoy some heavenly heat while the other side froze solid enough to chip. And of course, pets and livestock had no intention of being left out. A dog might sneak in beside you, tail wagging dangerously close to the flames. Chickens sometimes perched right on the hearthstones, clucking softly like feathery little fire guards. Every crackle of the logs, every soft collapse of an ember was a tiny reassurance. You're still here, still warm, for now. Peasants drifted off to sleep under that fragile dome of heat, exhaling clouds into the frigid air just outside the fire's reach. It wasn't comfort, it was life. Life clinging to warmth, one glowing coal at a time. And in the harsh winter months, survival wasn't a solo mission. No one made it through alone, unless, of course, they were aiming to become a particularly stylish ice sculpture by January. Winter survival was a team effort, a noisy, crowded, slightly smelly collaboration where every person's warmth depended on everyone else. A fire and a pile of hay could only go so far. But a neighbour's kindness? That could save lives. If the smoke stopped rising from someone's chimney, people noticed. Not just because old Tom still owed you 2 eggs, but because something might be wrong. Villages had their own kind of informal winter watch, usually made up of those too old or too young to work the fields. They kept an eye out for unusual silence, missed market days, or houses that looked just a little too still in the morning frost. It was medieval neighbourhood patrol, no reflective vests, but plenty of concern and the occasional goat in tow. If a family's fire went out, it was a full-blown emergency. A good neighbour might rush over with a smouldering coal wrapped in cloth, or just open their already overcrowded door to squeeze in a few more bodies for the night. Yes, it meant sleeping like sardines with strangers and livestock, but it beat finding a friend frozen stiff come spring. Even food became communal in a crisis. When the winter dragged on too long, villages would pull together what little they had left, bits of dried meat, grains, withered vegetables, and share it. It wasn't generosity, it was shared survival. Children got in on it too, running messages, carrying firewood, or ferrying hot embers across the village. No one was too young, too tired, or too grumpy when winter came knocking. Sure, villages had their squabbles. Someone always borrowed a cooking pot and never returned it, or let their goat wander into your cabbage patch. But when the nights grew colder than grudges, old arguments were quietly put aside. Because today you might be helping your neighbour, but tomorrow it might be you shivering on their doorstep. In the bleak heart of winter, the village itself became one enormous, awkwardly lovable family. A bit chaotic, occasionally passive-aggressive, but fiercely united in the goal of seeing spring. Of course, even with fire and friendship, medieval peasants didn't take chances. They prayed. A lot. When the wind roared like wolves outside their paper-thin walls, and the hearth flickered low, they turned to something beyond straw and smouldering logs. Divine backup. Faith wasn't reserved for Sundays. It was stitched into every frost-bitten breath. Before crawling under their scratchy wool and straw blankets, families would kneel and offer prayers. Quick ones, desperate ones, the kind that asked for warm toes, a strong roof, and no surprise blizzards in the middle of the night. Saints were part of the winter survival team too. Saint Blaise was asked to protect against sore throats, which made sense when one cold breath could leave you coughing for weeks. Saint Nicholas, long before his Santa Claus days, was believed to shield homes from disaster, especially during the lean, hungry months. Superstition wove itself into these rituals as well. Some families would sprinkle holy water near the hearth before bed, hoping to keep both spirits and sneaky drafts at bay. Others marked their doors with chalk after feast days, a prayer in white dust asking warmth and luck to pass through and stay a while. Because when the fire flickered low and the wind slipped through the cracks like a ghost, peasants reached for every tool they had: cloth, coals, community, and a bit of blessed hope. Candles had their place too, not the kind we buy for mood lighting or scent, but small vigil candles, often blessed by the village priest, or perhaps by that one elderly woman who everyone secretly thought might have a little magic in her bones. These flickering flames were more than just light. They were quiet prayers made visible. Left to burn through the coldest nights, they offered a trembling defiance against the darkness clawing at the walls. And no evening prayer was ever quite complete without a few desperate promises. Dear Lord, if you help us survive tonight, I swear I'll be nicer to the neighbour, even the one who keeps sneaking into our turnip patch. Faith wasn't ceremonial. It was constant, raw. It wasn't for celebration. It was for survival. Medieval peasants weren't asking for miracles. They were simply hoping for one more warm fire, one more bowl of stew, one more sunrise breaking through the frost. Hope didn't come in grand gestures. It was whispered into the smoky beams above their heads, tucked under scratchy blankets, and hidden in the shallow breaths they took beneath animal hides. But the truth was, despite all the cleverness, all the prayers, all the stubborn fire-keeping, winter still won sometimes. And when it didn't just take one or two. Sometimes it took everyone. Entire households, even whole villages, could vanish under a blanket of snow that muffled the world into silence. Some winters were crueler than others, like the famine-stricken year of 1315, when rains ruined crops, animals starved, and the cold finished what hunger had started. The stories from those years are grim, of people boiling leather shoes, chewing bark. In the most desperate cases, of things darker still, choices no one should ever have to make. Letting the fire die wasn't just a mistake, it could be the final one. Come spring, neighbours would sometimes find families still huddled together, frozen in each other's arms, as if trying to share warmth until the last breath. Homes crumbled too. Thatch gave way under heavy snow. Walls buckled, and when the roof collapsed in the dead of night, there were often no second chances. Dragging yourself through waist-deep snow to beg shelter from another home didn't guarantee mercy, especially if that home had nothing left to give. Illness came in with the cold. Starving bodies couldn't fight off infection. Coughs turned to fever, bronchitis, pneumonia. A simple shiver in December could become a funeral by January. And then there was frostbite. Fingers, toes, even ears, blackened and taken. Some survived the winter, but not in one piece. Those missing limbs were quiet reminders. I made it, but winter left its mark. But maybe the most haunting thing wasn't death itself. It was how ordinary it became. People accepted that not everyone would see spring. They grieved, yes, but they also prepared. Death was just another caller, wrapped in frost, knocking on every door in turn. And still, they endured. Somehow, through the sorrow, the smoke, and the frost-bitten silence, medieval peasants pressed forward. They grieved, they worked, they prayed. Because as long as a single coal glowed in the ashes, as long as someone's breath still fogged the air, there was reason to hope. When we look back now, we often focus on the suffering, the cracked hands, the smoke-filled homes, the endless grey winters. But that's not the whole story. Hidden under all of that hardship was something far stronger: resilience, pure, unshakable human resilience. They didn't have heaters or warm boots or even the assurance they'd survive the week, but they had determination and grit. They found ways to adapt, to bank fires, to pack walls with moss and mud. to huddle together with goats and babies and the odd chicken and make it to spring. They built communities not just of people, but of trust. When food ran out, they shared. When illness struck, they gathered around the sick. And when a fire went out, someone showed up, with a coal, a blanket, or just a body to share warmth with. No one made it alone. That was never the rule. Their faith, too, wasn't just habit. It was endurance. It gave them something to whisper into the dark. Not out of fear alone, but out of hope. A fragile, flickering kind of hope that said, tomorrow might be warmer, brighter, kinder. And somehow, it was. Because of their sacrifices, their small, unglamorous victories, we stand where we are today. Bit by frozen bit, they carried humanity through. Every warm home we live in, every thick blanket we wrap around ourselves, every winter night we spend in comfort. It's all built on the backs of those who never gave up. So the next time the wind rattles your windows and you reach for another blanket, maybe pause for a moment. Think of them. The nameless, fearless ones. The ones who turned freezing mud and smoke into a legacy. One ember, one breath, one stubborn heartbeat at a time. Now, let's talk about their eating habits. In a time when most snacks looked questionable and tasted even worse, apple fritters were a small golden miracle, sweet, hot, and just dangerous enough to feel exciting. These crispy little rounds were about as close as medieval folks got to a donut, if you subtract the frosting and ignore food safety altogether. So what did fritters actually have in them? Apples, of course. But not the shiny, polished kind you find at the grocery store today. These were wild, knobby, tart little things, often swiped from a neighbour's orchard or plucked off the ground behind a tavern. The fruit was chopped, then mixed into a rough batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes a splash of ale. Because let's be honest, water in the Middle Ages wasn't always trustworthy. Ale, on the other hand, made everything a bit warmer and funnier. Then came the frying, a medieval performance all its own. Oil, usually pig fat, was reused until it had enough personality to deserve a name. It added flavour, or at least something that passed for it. But the end result? Hot, crispy edges, a soft, steamy centre, and enough grease to count as a protective coating. One bite fresh from the pan, and you were risking mild burns. But it was worth it. If you were fortunate, and had the kind of coin that made bakers raise eyebrows, you might even get a sprinkle of imported sugar on top. For the rest, a little honey or spiced syrup did the job. Either way, it was sweet enough to make you forget the boiled cabbage waiting for dinner. Fritters were the kind of thing you grabbed on market days after church, or when you needed to bribe a child with something that didn't involve carrots. Birds loved them, kids begged for them, adults devoured them. Sure, sometimes they were burnt, undercooked, or tasted like they'd been made in the same oil as last week's fish, but when they were good, they were unforgettable. One delicious bite, and for a fleeting moment, medieval life didn't seem quite so bleak. Now, if fritters were the donut of the Middle Ages, cheese curds were basically medieval popcorn. Small, chewy, and oddly comforting in their simplicity. They didn't melt, they didn't stretch, they didn't sparkle. But that was part of the charm. Medieval cheese wasn't made to impress. It was made quickly, eaten quickly, and expected to survive questionable travel conditions and the occasional hoofprint. Cheese curds were the soft, early pieces scooped out before the cheese aged into something that could break a toe. The process? Simple. Milk was curdled using rennet, which, fun fact, came from the stomach lining of baby animals. Unappetizing? A little. But it did the trick. The resulting curds were gently pressed, lightly salted, and eaten before anyone had time to ask too many questions. Some were soft and creamy. Others bounced back when you bit them. If they squeaked on your teeth, that was considered a bonus. They weren't fancy, but they were filling, portable, and oddly satisfying. Monks snacked on them between prayers. Travellers carried them like edible Lucky Charms. Kids popped them into their mouths like little dairy candies, assuming the cows had been generous that week. You could fry them, crumble them over porridge, or just eat them by the handful while pretending your entire life didn't smell like goat. Cheese curds didn't need a feast day or special occasion. They were always around, modest, reliable, and just comforting enough to remind you the world hadn't completely fallen apart. Sure, some batches tasted a bit suspicious, but freshness was a loose concept back then. With enough salt and blind optimism, most folks just smiled and chewed. And when compared to the other options, say cold broth or leftover cabbage water, cheese curds felt like a blessing. They weren't glamorous, but they were warm, dependable, and oddly persuasive, especially when trying to bribe a stubborn child or a spoiled barn cat. Let's be honest, turnips are not dessert. That should be the first rule of sweets. But in medieval times, when sugar was a luxury, apples weren't always in season, and creativity often came from hunger, someone looked at a turnip and thought, you know what? This could be pie. And just like that, turnip pie entered the culinary scene. Now, to be fair, it wasn't always terrible. Sometimes it was even okay. Picture soft, mashed turnips, hopefully cooked enough, mixed with eggs, maybe a dash of honey or a handful of dried fruit if the cook had a generous streak that day. All of it wrapped inside a thick, no-nonsense crust made of flour, water, and pure determination. The final product? Edible, surprisingly. At its best, it had a slightly sweet, earthy flavour, a little like root vegetable pudding in a coat of ambition. At its worst, it tasted like someone had baked a mistake and called it lunch. Still, turnip pie had staying power. Why? Because turnips were cheap, and pie crust could cover a lot of culinary sins. Burnt, hide it. Bitter, add honey, questionable smell, bake it longer and hope for the best. It wasn't anyone's idea of indulgence, but in a world where desserts were rare and vegetables were aggressive, turnip pie tried its best, and that counted for something. You'd find them at festivals, monastery tables, or on especially inventive fasting days. Some recipes even added spices. Nutmeg if the monks were feeling wealthy, pepper if the cook was feeling reckless. Occasionally raisins showed up, confusing everyone involved. Nobles wouldn't touch it unless they were trying to relate to commoners or needed to impress someone with their humble side. But for regular folks, it was dessert, sort of. It came in a crust and didn't taste like dirt, close enough. Now, if there was a true champion of medieval comfort food, it was the meat pasty, a compact pie stuffed with seasoned meat, wrapped in a folded crust, and baked until golden, or more often, nearly burnt. Think of it as the medieval version of a hot pocket, but with a greater sense of risk. What made the pasty special wasn't just the flavour, it was portable, tough, and practical. You could take it into the fields, on the road, or even to a public hanging, if that was on the agenda. The thick pastry shell helped keep the filling warm, and more importantly, kept it away from dirt, grime, and the occasional rat encounter. But let's talk about that filling. Meat in the Middle Ages was a flexible term. If you lived near a manor or game lands, you might get pork, lamb, or even venison. If not, your options expanded into creative territory: rabbit, pigeon, eel, hedgehog. Anything that moved slow enough to be caught could end up inside. Spices like pepper, garlic, or sage were tossed in to mask the age of the meat, or to pretend it wasn't something you found yesterday by the river. Still, when your daily diet was stale bread and onions, biting into a hot, greasy pasty felt like winning the lottery. There were meatless versions too, for religious days or vegetarian leanings, stuffed with root veggies, leeks, or cheese. But make no mistake, the meat ones were the fan favourites. You didn't ask what was in them. You just hoped the cook wasn't having a bad day and took a bite. Sometimes people marked their pasties with initials or symbols to claim them, especially among workers and miners. Some even had a thick crust edge made just for holding with dirty hands, meant to be thrown away afterward or, more realistically, shared with the local rat population. Were they good? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. That was part of the thrill. You didn't eat a pasty for certainty. You ate it because you were hungry and emotionally prepared to roll the dice. And when it came to breath fresheners, medieval style, look no further than candied fennel seeds. These tiny, sugary seeds were the closest thing to a breath mint you could find in a world where brushing your teeth meant swishing with wine and crossing your fingers. Coated in a crunchy layer of hard sugar, These little treats served triple duty: post-meal refreshment, a mild digestive aid, and a dental hazard waiting to happen. Making them wasn't easy either. Sugar had to be imported, boiled, beaten, and shaped by hand. So the very existence of candied seeds means someone really, really wanted their breath to smell like something other than salted goat meat. They were especially popular in noble circles, served after meals in tiny bowls, alongside polite conversation and lingering pieces of mutton between teeth. The flavour, strong. Fennel tastes like licorice with an attitude, and it didn't care what you thought. You either crunched it down and enjoyed the burn, or you swallowed quickly, smiled politely, and hoped no one offered you seconds. Still, in a time where minty fresh was science fiction, a crunchy herbal sugar seed felt like progress. Candied seeds had more than one job. Sure, they freshened your breath, but they were also trusted to settle your stomach, especially after a medieval feast featuring 3 kinds of poultry and enough mead to confuse your ancestors. Think of them as a mix between chewing gum and antacids, only with more crunch and higher dental risk. And yes, they were hard, like crack a molar if you're too bold hard. You didn't just chew them casually. You approached them with caution, testing one between your teeth, waiting for that first crack like you were disarming a snackable landmine. It was a gamble every time. The wealthy chomped down on these sugary seeds like medieval breath mints. For everyone else, there were knockoff versions, usually honey, crushed herbs, and hope. Less refined, slightly sticky, but just believable enough to pretend. In the wide and weird world of medieval snacking, candied fennel seeds weren't the most filling, but they packed a punch. They made you feel fancy, even if you were barefoot and still smelled like goose stew. They didn't fix bad breath, but they covered it long enough to get through a wedding or confession. Now, if there was a true golden child of medieval sweets, it was the humble honey cake. Sticky, dense, and a little unruly, honey cakes were what happened when bakers got bold and sugar was still locked away in some nobleman's vault. Honey, on the other hand, was the poor man's sweetener, assuming you had bees, knew someone with bees, or were brave enough to raid a hive with nothing but a cloth sack and blind optimism. Honey cakes were made with flour, water, and a whole lot of sticky determination. The final result? A firm slab of chewiness that could either delight your taste buds or be used to stop a door from closing. If the household had a little extra coin, spices made an appearance. A dash of nutmeg, a whisper of clove, maybe even cinnamon if you were showing off. Dried fruits joined the party when they weren't being turned into wine or stolen by village kids. Honey cakes were popular at weddings, feast days, and local fairs, not just because they were tasty, but because they kept well. You could bake them, drop them, step on them, and still serve them with pride. They were also multi-purpose, offered as gifts, bribes, and the occasional sarcastic offering. Here, I made this for you. It's sweet, unlike you. They weren't delicate either. Cutting one required a sharp knife and silent prayers. But eating them? Easy. Just be prepared for honey-coated fingers and a jaw workout. They weren't light, they weren't fluffy, but they were satisfying. They tasted like effort and warmth, like someone had tried their best to make life feel a little bit brighter. And then there were fish skin cracklings, perhaps the most unexpectedly addictive snack to crawl out of the medieval kitchen. Crispy, salty, and undeniably fishy, these little bits weren't pretty, but they got the job done. Chances are no one meant to invent them. More likely, someone stared at a pile of leftover fish skin after gutting a herring and thought, what if we just threw this in some hot fat? And somehow, it worked. If you lived by the coast or near a river, fish was a staple, and nothing went to waste. The meat went in the stew, the heads went to the cats, and the skins. They met their fate in bubbling oil until they curled, crackled, and turned into ocean-flavoured crisps. Surprisingly, they were good. Crunchy like a fallen leaf, with a taste that could only be described as intensely aquatic. Sprinkle on a bit of salt, maybe some herbs if you were feeling fancy, and you had a snack that was halfway between a miracle and a dare. They were portable, fat-rich, and oddly addictive. Perfect for workers, travellers, or anyone brave enough to eat something that smelled like it could still swim away. Were they refined? Not at all. But they were quick, crunchy, and a proud example of medieval efficiency. In a world where nothing was wasted and flavour was found in the strangest places, fried fish skin was a triumph, crispy, greasy, and just indulgent enough to make you forget about the turnip pie cooling on the table. After a long day of chopping wood, chasing down escaped goats, or arguing over whose sheep were whose, medieval bodies craved something greasy, salty, and satisfying. Enter fried fish skins. Sailors lived off them. Soldiers swore by them. And peasants? They sold them hot and crispy outside taverns, raking in a few coins, and the pleasure of feeding drunk people something crunchier than their arguments. Did they still have a few scales on them sometimes? Yes. Did they occasionally curl into odd, vaguely threatening shapes? Also, yes. But by the culinary standards of the time, these were practically elegant, crispy, flavorful, and best of all, unlikely to send you running to the nearest field with medieval food poisoning. The only issue? The smell. Fry up a batch inside your home, and congratulations. You now lived in what could best be described as Neptune's laundry basket. For a week. But you'd be forgiven, because they were good. When life handed you stale bread and lukewarm beer, you didn't complain. You invented what might be the most medieval comfort food imaginable, bread soaked in ale. Known in various corners of the old world as soups, trench toast, or just dinner, this dish was essentially poor man's French toast, minus the sugar, cinnamon, eggs, and joy. It worked like this. Take yesterday's bread, so old and hard it could stop a crossbow bolt, and dunk it in ale. Not the fancy hoppy kind brewed in oak barrels by bearded hipsters. No, this was weak, murky, home-brewed ale, fermented in someone's back shed and stirred with a stick that may have also been used to discipline chickens. The bread soaked it all up like a medieval sponge with trust issues. It softened, swelled, and transformed into something almost chewable. Was it delicious? Depends. If the fire was warm, your mood was decent, and you squinted just right, sure, kind of. It was hearty, slightly bitter, and didn't immediately offend the taste buds, which in those days was a win. It was the perfect meal for labourers, apprentices, and anyone who didn't have the time or teeth for multiple courses. Sometimes people fancied it up, a pinch of herbs, a crumb of cheese, or, on a miracle morning, a fried egg if the hens felt generous. On special days, the ale might be spiced, turning your soggy bread into something that vaguely resembled a holiday treat. It was simple, quick, and more importantly, it made use of everything. Bread too hard? Soak it. Ale turning weird? Pour it on. In the medieval kitchen, waste was not welcome. The only catch? It didn't travel. Once soaked, that bread was on a countdown to mush. Eat fast or you'd be staring into a bowl of sad, bready regret. Still, on cold nights, with a bit of fire and silence, it did the trick. Ale-soaked bread may not have looked like much, but it fed generations with warmth, carbs, and a touch of fermented comfort. And if you've ever looked at a hunk of bread and thought, you know what this needs? Wine? Congratulations! You and the medieval nobility had something in common. Soups in wine were one of the more refined, red, weirdly specific ways to enjoy soggy carbs. Was it dessert? Was it a snack? Was it an experience? Yes. The idea was simple. Toast some bread, ideally not the kind that crumbled into dust on contact, and dunk it into warm, spiced wine, not fresh wine. This was last season's vintage, pulled from a clay jug that may have once stored pickled onions. Add in spices like cloves, maybe cinnamon, and suddenly it was elegant. The result was a spoonable wine-infused mush served at banquets, nighttime gatherings, and awkward dinners where no one wanted to talk about taxes. You'd sit there, eating your soaked toast, while lute music trailed off in the background, pretending this wasn't just an accident someone decided to serve in a bowl. Done well, it was comforting. The wine gave it richness. The bread added texture. The spices gave it the illusion of sophistication. Done poorly, it was wet bread in purple juice, and no amount of dried fruit could make you feel like a noble. Sometimes, chefs added extras, raisins, nuts, or even an egg dropped right in. At that point, it wasn't food, it was a riddle. Peasants made their own versions, using vinegar or thin ale, which turned this upper-class treat into a humble meal that hovered between desperation and creativity. Despite the oddness, soups in wine stuck around. People liked the warmth, the richness, and the brief feeling of indulgence it brought, like you were part of something grand, even if it did taste like regret in a goblet. Because in the Middle Ages, food wasn't just about taste. It was survival, celebration, and sometimes a moment of weird comfort soaked in wine and served with a spoon. Dried fruit was medieval gold, sweet, exotic, and tough enough to survive a crusade or three, but let's not romanticize it. This wasn't your modern, resealable trail mix with cute packaging. No, medieval dried fruit had one goal: stay edible until spring. Taste was a bonus. Texture? Aggressively chewy. And let's just say, teeth were optional. You had your classic lineup: raisins, figs, dates, and for the truly elite, imported prunes. These fruits were sun-dried, smoke-dried, or simply left on a windowsill long enough to become shelf-stable. They were shriveled, tough, and so dense they could probably stop an arrow. Imagine a fruit that doubles as a snack and a weapon. But they were sweet, intensely sweet. Like nature's candy, if nature had a questionable sense of fun. Nobles adored them. Monks stashed them away like treasure. Children treated them like edible diamonds. The problem? You needed the jaw strength of a blacksmith to chew them. Figs came with a built-in dental trap. Tiny seeds that acted like floss from the underworld. Dates were so sticky they could weld your molars shut. Raisins lodged in your teeth for hours like clingy guests at a feast. Still, dried fruit had its place. Tossed in porridge, baked into honey cakes, mixed into meat pies when cooks felt creative. Rich households might soak them in wine, drizzle them with rosewater, or wrap them in pastry just to show off. For peasants, dried fruit was a rare luxury, saved for feast days, weddings, or that one time your aunt remembered you existed. And when you finally got your hands on a few pieces, you ate them slowly, quietly, and probably in hiding. Sharing was for fools. Storage was easy. They lived in cloth sacks or tucked into clay pots and hardened over time into something closer to medieval jawbreakers. But that just made them last longer, or double as a projectile in sibling disputes. Sweet, slightly dangerous, and always memorable, dried fruit was the candy of the courageous. Now let's talk about breakfast, or maybe revenge. Because when you woke up hungry and needed something dense, greasy, and slightly terrifying, you reached for a blood pudding ball. Imagine a sausage roll with all the subtlety of a punch to the stomach. Bold, iron-rich, and unapologetically primal, these meatballs meant business. Born from the no-waste mentality of medieval kitchens, blood pudding balls started with fresh pig's blood, though in desperate times, any blood would do. Add oats, onions, suet, and spices. Stir until it resembled something between a porridge and a dare. Then shape into balls and fry until they're crisp on the outside and deeply mysterious on the inside. The flavor? Bold, earthy, slightly metallic. You'd be tasting iron and salt for the rest of the day and questioning your life choices by dinner. But they were filling. 2 could replace lunch, 4 could carry you through battle or a long sermon. Rich folk might add herbs or pair them with ale and eggs. Peasants were just glad it wasn't turnips again. You'd find them at fairs, roadside stalls, and markets where the smell of livestock mixed with frying fat and ambition. They were hot, portable, and suspiciously satisfying. Sure, the idea of eating fried blood might raise modern eyebrows, but back then it was just efficient eating with a side of crunch. And then, pancakes. But not the soft, fluffy kind you'd stack high and drown in syrup. Medieval pancakes were battle-ready, thin, tough, and fried in enough lard to make your arteries weep in Latin. Made from flour, water, or ale, and eggs when available, these flat griddle cakes weren't here to charm you. They were here to feed you. You'd pour the batter onto a sizzling iron slab, usually slick with bubbling pig fat, and wait for the magic, or something resembling it. No non-stick pans, no careful measuring, just ladle and hope. What came out was a ragged circle, crispy at the edges, chewy in the middle, and always slightly uneven. Sometimes undercooked, sometimes charred, often both. Still, they were a treat. In a world where breakfast usually involved sadness and cabbage, pancakes felt like celebration. They could travel too, stuff one in your pouch and it might still be edible by the time you reached the next village. Sort of. Add a fried egg on top if the chicken was generous that day, or smear on some leftover lard for that extra why not flavour. They weren't pretty, they weren't sweet, but medieval pancakes got the job done, one chewy bite at a time. A splash of ale gave them bite, a drizzle of honey, that was pure luxury. Toss in some chopped onions or a few herbs, and suddenly your breakfast was flirting with gourmet. But most of the time, it was just grease and pancake, hot off the pan and scarfed down like you'd just outrun a tax collector with bad knees. These weren't dainty brunch items. These were survival discs. Pancakes were for everyone. Peasants, monks, travelling merchants, even nobles who got bored of pheasant stew. Some folks stacked them with cheese, others dunked them in broth, and a few just rolled them up like a scroll and called it a day. Sweet, savoury, charred beyond reason, it didn't matter. They were filling. If you had leftovers, you could layer them into a makeshift cake or wear them as edible armour against disappointment. Lent and fasting days only made them more popular. No meat, no problem. Pancakes were the legal loophole everyone loved, fried, greasy, and just questionable enough to feel slightly sinful. They also hid all kinds of things inside. Mystery vegetables, forgotten scraps, experimental regrets. Were they pretty? Never. But they got the job done. All they needed was heat and hunger. And somewhere between a snack and a sacrament, you'd find the humble medieval wafer. Thin, crisp, and suspiciously light. These little crisps teetered between dessert and dental risk. Wafers were everywhere, handed out outside churches, sold at fairs, clutched by monks, and sometimes floating in your soup like a papery crouton blessed by bad timing. Let's be clear, we're not talking about modern-day cream-filled treats. Medieval wafers were made of flour, water, eggs, and not much else. If you were feeling extravagant, you might add a drop of honey or rose water, but mostly it was just bland batter poured into a scorching hot iron mould and squeezed like a medieval grilled cheese, minus the cheese. The result? A lacy, holy-looking crisp that felt like eating a religious relic. They were patterned too. Crosses, flowers, saints' faces, depending on the mood of the baker and how well the iron press behaved that morning. These designs didn't change the taste, but they gave you something to ponder as you chewed slowly and tried not to feel underwhelmed. Wafers were popular because they were fast, cheap, and profitable. Vendors lined up outside churches on feast days, hawking them to the faithful like edible bookmarks. Buy now, repent later wasn't the official slogan, but it kind of was. Structurally, they were fragile. One wrong look and they'd snap. Store them, good luck. Transport them, say goodbye. Eating one in the open air was basically gambling with crumbs. Still, wafers had charm. They were light, crispy, and just celebratory enough to feel like a treat. Rich folks paired them with cheese or fruit. Everyone else bought them by the dozen and inhaled them before the wind claimed them. And then there was Sucket. Even the name sounds like something sticky that clings to your teeth and your sins. This was no humble snack. This was sugar-drenched opulence. Fruit, usually something rare like oranges, dates, or ginger, boiled until it surrendered, then drowned in syrup, sealed in jars and shelved like sugary trophies. Sucket wasn't for the common villager scrubbing mud off their boots. It was for nobles, aristocrats, people who could afford to turn fruit into dessert instead of lunch. Eating it felt like misbehaving with a bishop watching. Sweet? Absolutely. Overwhelming? Sometimes. But you didn't say no to Sucket. You savoured it, slowly, smugly, probably while lounging on an embroidered cushion. It was a status snack, gifted like fine wine or flashy relics. "Here, have this delicacy," it said. "I like you, just not enough to give you property." Sugar was a luxury, fruit was seasonal. But Sucket, that was pure medieval decadence in syrup form. Reserved for royal weddings, visiting dignitaries, or, if you were truly absurdly rich, random Wednesdays just because you could. Sucket wasn't your average sweet, it was a sugar-soaked flex. The process, downright obsessive. First, you'd boil your fruit. Think citrus peels, ginger, or dates, in syrup. Maybe honey if you were wholesome. Refined sugar if your spice merchant owed you or you just enjoyed watching peasants gasp. Then you drain it, let it sit, and repeat, again and again. Because this wasn't just preservation, it was fruit being reborn through sheer culinary domination. The final product was a sticky, jewel-toned candy that practically glowed with excess. Some versions stayed syrupy, served in fancy glass dishes that screamed, "I have a pantry bigger than your house." Others were dried, rolled in more sugar, and handed out as neat little cubes that could rot your teeth and elevate your status at the same time. But make no mistake, suck-it wasn't just food. It was a statement. It meant you had wealth, connections, and possibly a dedicated sugar-stirring servant who hadn't seen daylight since Lent. At banquets, it was passed around like treasure. Guests took a piece, tried to look dignified, and instantly regretted not pocketing a few more when no one was looking. Peasants? They watched from the kitchen, maybe snuck a lick off a forgotten spoon and considered it the highlight of their decade. And was it worth it? Honestly, yes. Suck-it tasted like dessert. Not just sweet, but sophisticated, refined, a little burst of joy in a world mostly filled with cabbage and disappointment. And now, fried eel. Ah yes, the unlikely superstar of medieval snacking. It slithered from riverbanks to royal halls without ever once stopping to wonder if people were really that hungry. Spoiler, they were, and eel delivered. Back then, rivers were basically eel buffets. Easy to catch, even easier to cook, and surprisingly delicious when fried. Sure, raw eel looked like something you'd summon in a nightmare, but once in hot fat, it transformed. Golden, crispy, weirdly satisfying. The catch? You had to catch it first. Preferably at night, with bare hands or crude traps. Picture a peasant ankle-deep in murky water, wrestling something that felt like a slimy, sentient shoelace. Once subdued, the eel had to be skinned, a process best described as not fun, like peeling a wet rope that really didn't want to cooperate. Then came the hot oil, tossed in whole or in chunks, seasoned if you had ambition. Fried until the skin crackled and the meat firmed into a savory snack that tasted like calamari if it had gone on a spiritual journey through the forest. People ate it everywhere, in taverns, at roadside stalls, during village fairs. Even religious folks got in on the action. See, eel wasn't technically meat according to medieval rules, so it became the loophole protein of choice during fasts. Monks ate it, nobles celebrated it, kings had it baked into pies that looked suspiciously like serpents in disguise. Yes, it had bones, lots of them. Yes, it sometimes twitched after death. But if you could get past the existential dread of eating something that looked like it might curse your lineage, fried eel was really good. Crisped skin, tender inside, just the right amount of grease to make your fingers shine with guilt and glory. Today, eel might seem like a bizarre choice. Back then, it was the weird little miracle that filled bellies, made fast days interesting, and proved once and for all, if you fry it, they will eat it.